Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Welcome back to LetUsThinkAboutIt.com. As if anyone ever hears a podcast and then just goes to the website. .com. Anyway, we have another tweener cast today. But for the life of me, I just can't get motivated to really help us solve all the problems of capitalism. It's too big, much brain work, writer's sleepy. Yeah, so instead, I'm just going to be a good consumer and go to the movies. Why not, right? So I haven't seen a movie in a theater in a while, so my wife and I went to go see Free Guy on Sunday. And of course, this features the gorgeous, hunky, and adorably funny Ryan Reynolds. And yes, bit of a giveaway there, but he's on my laminated list. Yeah, mostly because he's rich. It has nothing to do with his abs or sense of humor. It's really just that big old bank account that I want access to. So yeah, you should probably see this movie before listening to this podcast. But honestly, I don't guess it really matters because the movie's going to be fun anyway, even if I spoil the plot. But for those of you who really, care about Hollywood stories, you should be able to predict the outcome just by watching the trailer, right? Yeah, you've seen the story enough. But either way, I will give you 10 whole seconds to switch to a different podcast. Okay, 10. So, on with the show. So what you're going to get here is a basic summary followed by kind of how my brain works, and this is based a lot on what I'm reading. It changes all the time, right? So this goes a lot into the meta questions and assumptions that the movie makes and the kind of easy simplicity of making capitalism the bad guy nowadays, issues of identity, and of course there's like this idea of love and goodness somehow being synonymous, and I'm going to kind of question that a little bit too. But also, if we construct an AI, an artificial intelligence, isn't that kind of like constructing a government or a state, right? Where we really do need to be worrying about the underlying motivations of the programmers. So, yeah, we need to worry. The synopsis. So my wife and I, we used to go to the movies every Sunday, well, almost every Sunday. But of course, COVID, it ended that. So we kind of had considered it our religion to go to the matinee on Sunday, right? Because, of course, everyone else in Texas is busy with, real religions, and we just had our Hollywood religion. And so on Sunday mornings, we could have the chapel all to ourselves. So 10:30 or 11, we'd go to the theater. We would, of course, tithe at the door, and we'd line up to partake of the sacrament of popcorn and Coke, and perhaps the body of Marlon Brando and the blood of Ingrid Bergman. Yeah, we'd take a seat in the pew facing the pulpit, get ready to feel something. Or maybe just watch the same plot lines over and over again, kind of like in church. It's just same stories over and over. The special child discovers he has powers and is special. And then adventures and temptations ensue, but good triumphs in the end with some moralizing about being good. Yeah, so anyway. But to start, of course, we warm up with a few light tunes, right? Some trailers, some light capitalism to get you riled for even more capitalism in the future. And then, of course, we would just zone out until the credits roll, right? Thank you again, Grip Boy and Best Boy, for your mighty and generous gripping and busting. May I, too, feel your grip someday upon my ankle as I fall from a helicopter or leap to save a puppy. Amen. So this week we were offered a story in our chapel of an NPC. This is a non-player character in a video game that's called Free City. So the movie Free Guy, right? Guy is played by Ryan Reynolds, and he becomes sentient, right? So you get it, like Free Guy is like freeing this guy named Guy from Free City, right? In a movie called Free Guy. And Free City is really this Grand Theft Auto style game in which Guy is repeatedly abused and killed just to respawn with a goofy grin and charming demeanor, right? Because why not? And as a relative newbie myself to video games, this whole bizarro land of literature and movies written from the perspective of non-sentient pixels, or basically background characters, kind of like, the red shirts in Star Trek and how they're there basically to die because somebody has to die. I find the literature and everything very funny and the movies to be very funny, but also this type of anthropomorphism really points out some tremendous foibles of history, right? Through literature, television, and video games, but a lot of it has to do with just like imperialism and conquest in general. It really points out some things about how we consider others. So Guy, once again, the NPC played by Ryan Reynolds, he's triggered awake by seeing a girl. Of course. Shocker, huh? Totally shocked. Wow. I'll be. So anyway, he somehow becomes a sentient algorithm. That is, he is aware. He's conscious of being conscious. So he's able to see his desires, to take action outside of the norm, and he's even able to judge the relative value and merits of his actions. Let's consider that kind of sentience, right? And awareness and moving forward. So he now has these desires and motivations, but they're primarily to be with a girl, but also, of course, to be a good guy. Hooray! Goodness, and his name is Guy, so good guy. Ha ha, oh boy. And of course, there's major filmic references here to things like Carpenter's They Live, where sunglasses become the gateway to perceive truth and ideology, which is probably also just a throwback all the way to Kant and the idea of filtering lenses of perception through things like green glasses or rose-tinted glasses, right? So anyway, what sparked the sentience? Well, let's get into the backstory. The backstory is two programmers, a girl and a guy. They develop an AI, an artificial intelligence engine. And this is an engine that's supposed to allow characters to grow and change without human input or interaction, right? So, of course, the programmers are, I don't know, maybe in love. I can't quite figure it out, but it's super cute and mushy, and maybe they're just too immature to know how to express it. Because really, kids are morons, and so am I, but work relationships are also very problematic, and especially when you're around very expensive electronic equipment, and you try to go through a romantic gesture and sweep off the desk, and, it's expensive. I mean, to say nothing of bodily fluids and keyboards. So, yeah. Anyway, naturally, to keep the plot going, there has to be a bad guy. So there's this totally rad bro capitalist, and he's played by Taiki Waititi. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he is hysterical. He's great. But he buys the AI, and he ends up scuttling their pure and sweet dreams. And they had this world that was going to just be dragonflies and waterfalls and self-evolving intelligences. So, yeah, they made an AI that was going to basically be a Garden of Eden terrarium. Yeah. Okay, but I really want to hammer home this point. These two young, awkward geniuses, who basically can't get out the words to get someone else out of their pants, frustratedly make a petri dish to grow life in. So yeah, they made a baby-making machine. Because they couldn't get past their own emotional immaturity to make their own baby. So now we have a sentient NPC who's basically suffering and crying in the garden to these two really clueless parent gods. So anyway, the AI engine. Well, lo and behold, the narcissistic capitalist snake buys it. And guess what? He secretly starts running his very demented Grand Theft Auto style game using this very pure Garden of Eden AI engine as the underpinning. So that's right, he turned the Garden of Eden into Mad Max, because Mad Max totally sells better, bro. And then to make this long synopsis even longer, of course the female programmer falls for the NPC. Oh, Squee, it's so cute. But just like, of course, right? Why not? And equally, of course, at the end, the NPC has to somehow be wiser than her and tell her, his creator, which is basically his god and his mom at the same time, what's going on, because humans are really dumb when emotion gets involved. The NPC has to tell her he was coded by someone, and the desire that made him act, that drove him to act and motivated him to be more than just his endless, mindless routine, it was coded into him by the male programmer. So as the NPC says, he is simply a love letter from the author.
I wrote you every day for a year.
You wrote me?
Yes.
Yuck. So anyway, right now I've laid all this out in a very problematized, cynical way, and that's because I want to jump into what I really want to talk about, which is not a movie synopsis. But they're the sort of narrative and ideological aspects, and of course we get to drag in a lot of politics and philosophy with things like Hobbes, Arendt, Nietzsche, and we're even going to try to squeeze some Deleuze in there, right? Because that just sounds fun to say. But then at the end, I'm going to try to stitch it all back together into a lovely little Hollywood story ending. Hooray! First thing, the moral. Romance. It's in every movie. But here, the protagonist creators, they end up apparently creating for pure and noble pursuits, not for mayhem and murder like those mean old capitalists. they program for beauty, and they use their talents for nobility, right? Even if that means that at the end they do have to break a whole lot of laws. And the capitalist, well, he's a greedy peepee head, and he corrupts and turns the pure into a tool for the sordid. He enhances the profane by building it on top of the sacred. So this is pretty despicable. This is basically beyond the Garden of Eden being polluted idea. It's more like putting a Starbucks on top of the Garden of Eden just to get to the pure water. And then, of course, you get this pure water, and then what do? You ruin it with over-roasted coffee beans. So the moral, pursue noble passions. Do not cave to the temptation of the base and the mean, though it surrounds you. The reward here is somehow going to be transmonetary, right? It's beyond money. And whatever your pure and noble actions are, they're going to reward you more deeply and for longer. And, who knows? At the end of the day, you may end up getting the girl or the guy or the hunky algorithm or even the dopey buff algorithm. Who knows? And by the way, this first point, the moral, it's mostly nonsense, but we all know that. So sure, it's a delightful repetition of all the moral flavors of bubblegum ice cream that we like. But as we will see, love and capitalism might actually just be simpatico at the extremes, and especially when you drag an AI into the story. Second thing, work, labor, action! Now, consider the creative act of designing an AI. Yeah, it takes work, right? And this creative energy, it has to be born of something, right? It's basically probably born of frustration and discontent, and then we'd probably have to tack on some hubris.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
And then we also have to ask, why would we do it? Why would we make an AI that's more human? Is it because we need to have something to talk to? Are we just that pathetic? I mean, there's already billions of humans with mouths and ears that we could talk to. If that's not working for you, there's lots of plants you can talk to, and they will give you better advice than most humans. So really, why are we so fixated on making anything like a human intelligence, right? Why be so fixated on human-shaped companionship and intelligence? I mean, most humans are really, really screwed up, and there's already billions of them, and we spend most of our lives trying to avoid them. So, yeah, anyway, I don't get it. It sounds like failure from the onset to me. But really, maybe what's going on is this whole AI thing is a sort of a challenge progression. So we go from robot labor to creative work, and this creative work mimics human behavior, and we finally get into self-aware action, right? It's to create something that can metacognate and make value distinctions. So what it seems to me is we're just trying to leap the uncanny valley, and we're really hoping that the artificial grass is greener. So one way to think about this in relationship to, yourself, and of course the movie, and artificial intelligence in general, is to use some distinct terms to sort of map out what's going on here. So we're going to borrow Hannah Arendt's terms for work, of course, which we talked about earlier, which she distinguishes something like this, okay? There is the drudgery of labor, the productivity of work, and the self-becoming of action. So labor, work, and action, and it kind of goes in that order. So let's give an example here, and a kind of a lame attempt to make sense out of this using the movie Free Guy. So, labor is the NPC without sentience repeating tasks over and over eternally. So, this is kind of like the robot making the same widget over and over again, or humans having to get food and eat over and over again, and so tiring, and then all of a sudden you have to poop over and over again, and whoo, I'll be. So, anyway, to work, which is the effort to create something like a new AI engine, or to make a factory, right? This is something that will outlast you, and it supersedes nature. And finally, we get into this stage of action. Action is to engage in the world in such a way that you create a story of yourself in the world. So this is the kind of notoriety Guy receives in the movie, right? At some point, he went from repetitive, endless labor of the NPC into work, right? He's working to level up so that he could get the girl. And then he finally turned into a contender at some point, right? And this affects not only his world, but the outer world as well. And this alters other people's understandings and their actions when his story becomes something other than what was previously known to exist. So, All that being said, what if we could get past this anthropomorphization that we keep doing here? Right? Because we get it that the AI is the framework, it's the engine, and the NPC is the manifestation of the AI's logic. But movies have taught us a lot of things, and that really, what if this AI is really that much smarter than us, right? Because it would have to be. What if the AI can sense and see that goodness, love, and purity are essentially our kryptonite? I mean, really, you just dangle anything cute and soft and squishy in front of us, and we get all non-logical. I mean, anything that's sort of like lovely and attractive and cuddly, and our brain just like goes to mush. So the best way an AI could get protection is to actually exhibit cutesy love. And of course, this is the plot of many sci-fi books and shows and movies, such as Ex Machina, or a little bit different as Vivarium. But basically, where the true test for an intelligent machine or species is to prey on the human weakness of emotions and love. It's disgusting, right? So this is that really ugly deep sea fish, right? The angler with the little light that dangles in front of its sharp-toothed mouth, and it uses that light to attract other fish as bait. So for us, in this story, that little light is the dangling Ryan Reynolds. Third thing, difference. So sentience, awareness. It's being aware of what you're trying to do, right? So that dangling ball that's in front of you, that little upside down Ryan Reynolds you just want to lick, well, that activity of licking is actually sparked by desiring something. And then you take action and you act on your desire. It is really pursuing desires which takes you from the laborious, maintained, repetitive, boring life to really seek a different outcome, which is novel fulfillment. That's what we're chasing here. Now, this could, of course, be good or bad. It can go both directions. But, of course, the movie moral hopes that your desires are pure rainbows and ice cream, sitting around with Jesus on the pier like good old NPC guy, instead of course, behaving like the fluffy butt bro, the capitalist snake, yo. So, anyway, to work and take action, it's work, and you have to create something. And what you're really creating here is your own story. Your actions are affecting the world, and this is your will to power come to life. So you're empowering yourself to achieve something greater than the endless monotony of life. But we must realize that creating also seems to come from a lack, not contentment. So this is kind of odd to think about. It can be both internal or external, but a negative moves us from our contentment, from that banal sameness. And what's the problem with sameness, Ryder? Well, sameness produces nothing new. It produces no difference. Now, difference produces change. It is change. So this is really Deleuzian shit right here. And I just started reading Deleuze, and the unfortunate side effect is you're all going to get to hear about it. And of course, it's paired up with my super elementary extrapolations because he's just way too smart for me. So, to return. On a very basic level, our discontent motivates something within us. Okay, cool. Now, a negative prompts action, but the problem with doing anything based off of a negative or a positive is it keeps you trapped within a category or a level of being. So, in kind of a Hegelian sense, we have to subsume the dialectic, right? And this is to overcome the positive negative. And the way you do that in the Hegelian sense, once again, is to take on that negativity until you ground it in the absolute principle. Okay, so while we discuss this, there's this kind of notion of why do we keep talking about negativity or negation? Why is it brought up so much? Well, there's this idea that the positive is, by definition, to implicitly be whatever the thing is. So it didn't have to be posited, right? So when I say a cat is a cat, well, that's kind of a redundant statement. But I definitely do not introduce the cat as not a dog, because then I have to say it's also not a deer, or it's not a whale. So this sort of doubles a discourse in infinite directions. So a difference must be stated, and that breaks continuities. So then at this point we have a contrariness, a contradiction, or it can become oppositional. Now, in Nietzschean terms, right, this is where we start to move beyond good and evil, is when we get past these kind of dialectics, because the fascinating thing is a negative and positive are both forms of difference. They actually sort of mirror and contain each other within their sort of own contrariness. And they're really just categorized by degree and distance from a certain point. So we actually have a central point that these two things bridge off from. And what we have to really do is escape all of that. We have to subsume that negative, take it on, and overcome. So it's not that you need to really hang on to all of this, but the degree of difference is foundational. And that's not just to being. Being is one thing, but what we're really after here is becoming. We need to become something, and this is an action. And basically, the further you go, the more difference you produce, the more transformative it becomes. Well, doesn't this all sound a lot like work? Well, yeah, of course it does. But it also is moving from labor to work, and then we start closing in on action, because that's really what we're after here, is to self-realize and possibly transcend. And of course, this is a flaw here because a lot of people start doing this. They think of self-actualization, and they think of the self, and they compare it with hyper-individualism because this is all about you. But people can self-actualize and dissolve their ego, and they can actually realize that loving others and participating in community, that is their path forward. So sameness and contentedness. Let's go back to this one more time. This can be when we're subservient to the same illusions. Because those illusions, well, it's not really being alive, right? It's merely enacting historical conservative values repetitively. Now, these are phantasms. These are all made up. And that's what movie projectors, and that's what shadows on cave walls are about in kind of a platonic sense. These are flattened, inverted forms of life. That makes this labor. It's laborious. It's endless. It's repetitive. So, when we escape the cave, that's when we're shunning the sameness. We're shunning the images on the wall. And this doesn't have to happen in one step like it's some unique moment. We can even do it at small scale over time through excessive repetition to a radical degree. And at this point, our small differences become big. They become the capital D difference, right? Now, we might have thought we had identity before, but by enacting such difference, we actually break the entire category. We approach transcendence through repetitive force, and we manifest the beautiful soul. And we enter the eternal return. Da-da-da-da. Eternal return. Yeah. Okay, so I know this is boring, but I find it kind of fascinating, right? The discontent that produces desire, well, that generates difference, and this runs through the entire movie of Free Guy. So the hapless coder produces an AI, of course. The crooked capitalist produces a lot of douchery, but he also employs tons of people. And of course, the awestruck NPC, he levels up to get the girl. And then, of course, luckily, he transcends that need. So all of these people go to extremes of difference, and they power through positive and negative forms, and to each there is a kind of affirmation. But what we're talking about here is taking action and difference, right? And this level of sentience, this being aware, right? Well, this is also the motivation to take action. And we're really talking about here is breaking the script and doing that through difference. Now, at the end of the day, of course, they're trying to make an AI that is sentient or aware. And why is this? Why would we need to make a machine to do this for us? I mean, it's probably because as humans, we would like to stay at the work level, and we don't really want to do the hard work to take on the action, right? To really become aware of ourselves. So instead, we're just going to build a machine, an AI, to achieve enlightenment for us. Wah, wah, wah.
Have you been forced into a fixed, established identity? Much like an NPC? Maybe a capitalist pig? What about being a cis-white programmer? Do you too want out of the humdrum world of having your face stepped on every day? What about having your love interest fall in love with an algorithm? Oh, well, we've all been there, buddy. Dude, bro, guy, yeah, and we totally get it. The problem is, you're basic, and your identity is identical. Yep, that's right. Say it with me. Your identity is identical. All right. But we can change all that. Call now, and for a limited time, we can ship you 3 cans of Deleuzian Difference Spray. Deleuzian Difference Spray. Stand out. Smell difference. Be difference. And watch her eternal return to you.
Now, we have mentioned caves and movie projectors, right? These are the representations of the world, the representations. So basically, it offers again the same presentation. Consider the idea that you're a player in a video game and you're blindly following the scripts and the quests that they have you on, and typically you end up encountering the same form represented to you numerous times. Infinite times, right? The representation of the world through form and category. And in a simplistic manner, you recognize these and you react to them. But really, at the end of the day, it mobilizes nothing. It just keeps repeating endlessly. And these representations, they end up mediating everything that you do. And we must somehow move beyond or above the script. So adding more, basically an infinite repetition of forms with the infinitesimally small, tiny differences, right? This kind of ends up keeping us trapped in the same point of view. Now, this is the logic of the simulacrum, which we've talked about previously. With no grounding, it's fractally expanding and dispersing, and this tends to be just more empty movement for us. Now, of course, it's got a life of its own, so it's kind of weird in that way, but it's like a headless monster. Now, this is also what capitalism and the market feeds us. Small, consumable changes that are overvalued and overmarketed. Now, what this tends to do to us is it incepts or co-ops our desire to move beyond the sameness, because it's feeding us infinite multiplicity as novelty, and we feel like it is the same. It's like the 31 flavors of saccharin as some sort of stand-in for enlightenment or achievement. Now, as Anthony de Mello says, we must wake up, drop your illusions, and as Deleuze may say, quit becoming the representation, become an experience.
Thing for Leviathan. Another thing, that's 4 things, Ryder. Jeez, this is already the best podcast I've ever heard. How could it get any better?
Well, it gets better because we're going to talk about AIs now, and we're going to compare them to something else. But first, we're going to start out talking about them in terms of labor, work, and action, right? So let's remember that robots do labor. Some AI can do creative work. But to do action, what does that look like exactly? Well, first, to compare this to AI, let's look at something else that humans have built that is vast, long-lasting, self-evolving, that sort of controls and manipulates us for our own good.
Ryder, you talking about God and religion?
Oh, no. Much too touchy of a topic. Let's just stick with politics. Okay, so if we talk about the state or the government, people set up these frameworks. These are the authors who set up a framework that is meant to serve citizens. But of course, there's going to be contradictions in there. For instance, the state has coercive power over us, yet it also allows us liberties. Okay, this is strange, right? Now, these are Isaiah Berlin's ideas of positive and negative liberty. There's some freedoms and there's some exchanges that have to happen there. So, for instance, you're free to walk down the street without getting killed because, of course, the state will seek out and punish the killer so people aren't incentivized to go around killing. But, of course, that's a super blunt example. But the overall idea is that citizens want to pursue their own benefit with the least amount of restriction. Yet, of course, we can't have other people coercing us or benefiting over us in a negative sense. So the state reserves the right to do that for themselves, right? And so then you, in theory, can get on with your self-actualizing best life, like knitting socks or building replica battleships or something. I don't know. I'm sure we're spending our time doing super important things. So yeah, anyway, creating a state sets up a complicated framework built to evolve over time. And it's really kind of a similar idea with AI, right? It's programmed within certain parameters, but it's also supposed to be intelligent so it can evolve. Now, the NPC in Free Guy is constrained, of course, by the limits of the game, the walls of the game. These would be the limits of the state, of rules and laws and stuff like that. And in this way, government limits shape us. But even when we enact our highest state of action, right, when we self-actualize within the community, when we tell our story, well, that all happens under an umbrella of the state. And fortunately or not, it happens in response to the state, whether we choose to acknowledge that or not. So the state is the story in which our story begins. In many ways, this is our terrarium. But who is the author, right? Who designed it? And whenever I self-actualize, am I actually capable of desires beyond the state coding? Beyond the walls of what my AI will allow? So Thomas Hobbes, He wrote Leviathan. Well, another spoiler here. His Leviathan isn't like the Kraken at all. No, it's basically a constructed state network. Yeah, so don't watch the movie. Yeah, but there is no movie, right? Because I think he wrote this in like the 1580s, which, by the way, is an insanely long time ago for us to still be talking about him, right? So think about that. If you could work on something and it lasted 400 years beyond you and people could still be mad at you 400 years later, well done, dude. Well done. It's just a book. Now, from what I gather, this book is one of the earliest ideas of a modern state, a state that recognizes individuals wanting freedoms rather than a sovereign's dictates determining people. Now, this was kind of an idea of a state that uses artifice. So this is a little bit of deception to sort of constrain and balance for, human monstrosity and brutishness and greed and all that kind of stuff. But overall, the state's goal was to serve individuals. So the key innovation here with Leviathan and Hobbes is individualism. But of course, individualism or liberty 400 years ago, yeah, that doesn't have the same meaning that it does today. We have really loaded those terms down with a lot of baggage. We kind of latched onto them and amplified them. So now, 1940s, you get into something like with Hannah Arendt, right? And she sees what the Nazi regime has perpetrated. Well, she ended up despising Hobbes for his mechanistic reduction to turn citizens into subjects, and then turn those subjects into cogs. Because she saw the evil of a cog through a bureaucrat like Eichmann. She saw what that could perpetrate. So yes, Hannah Arendt's state would be very different from Hobbes' state. Because, of course, she would express her state through her understanding and motivations. These are the intents of the author. And, of course, if they built an AI, you could just imagine what the parameters or desires might be. They would be completely different. Now, here in America, we have what is called a representative democracy. Okay, so this is a fascinating idea, but maybe we shouldn't think of democracy as the key point. Maybe we should think of representation as the key point. And this points out that the founders were actually quite fearful of true democracy, because this would be the tyranny of the majority, as Tocqueville says, right? They set up the state to have checks and balances, and all the decisions would pass through representatives. So the state could evolve over time, but it was designed as well to marginalize and relegate the actual citizens. So it has the appearance of democracy, but that's really only there to placate the citizenry, I think. Okay, and we of course could get way into that because the story we're told is not the code that our country was programmed with. Now this is very much the same in Free Guy, except maybe a little bit in reverse. In the game Free City that the NPC is in, Ryan Reynolds' character, well, Free City is a morally bankrupt story, but it was built on an AI engine that was pure and noble. So it's kind of the reverse. Now, when our founders built the artificial framework, the AF, or the political AI engine, that we call a constitution, it appears to be based on the premises of equality and liberty because they use those words. But it never actually allowed for equality or freedom. So these contradictions within the system means that as it evolves, particular points increase in prominence and divergence. Now this is a problem within the original code that gets amplified over time because of course it was written from a super biased perspective back in the 1780s. Now similar to Guy, the NPC, right, who comes alive, having his code written by a smitten coder made him smitten as well, right? So the impulse to create means that the creation takes on the traits or motivations of the creator. And I probably didn't need to spell that out. You probably got it early on. And yes, we can apply even more identifying labels here, right? The author is a cisgendered, educated, white American man who wrote a cisgendered white man as the NPC, right? So, problematic because these things all just become mirrors. Now, the issue here, though, is if through some sort of motivation and difference, what if one can overcome and supersede the fixed categorical identity that was programmed in you? It's possible, with enough difference and awareness.
Finally, the conclusion.
So, okay, one thing that I haven't discussed too much, but I'm pretty sure is key, is that for Arendt, to take action is to manifest your story in public, not in private. And to become aware as a person, to move from labor to work to action, well, By the way, you can do all three at once. You know that, right? I mean, it's not like once you achieve self-actualization or enlightenment, you don't eat or poop anymore. Or maybe you do. I don't know. I haven't achieved it yet. So let's get back to this. The state has, of course, many roles. Some of them are protection, some of them are economics. It's stuff like that. But it's also to develop and allow this path. It's basically a way to serve the citizens that will allow them to pursue self-actualization, to becoming their best self. And whether or not that is that you turn into a capitalist pig or a horny coder or a hunky action hero, it doesn't matter. They're all fine, right? The path should be open for you. But it really often isn't for many people. So there's a friction here between, of course, the story told, individualism and freedom, and of course what will actually be tolerated. We also have what is legal versus what is permissible. And there's this kind of, let's call it an interstitial gap between these two spaces that some people can really occupy and work to expand. Now, as Guy found out in the game as an NPC, his actions were not explicitly denied because they were new. No one thought he could do them. They were never considered. He was not considered because he was not seen. He wasn't even a he or any type of human. Now, this gets into some concepts I recently learned from Charles Mills. I was listening to The Racial Contract, which Elle recommended to me, where colonizing imperialists end up seeing indigenous people as subhuman, savages. They saw them as not human. So the logic here, when it amplifies out, is that somebody like Kant, the Western world's preeminent moral philosopher, well, he could end up being extremely racist because his morality only applied to civilized men, which were also, by default, posited as white men. So his categorization blinded him. And so the problem is, education, ethics, and state apparatuses are all developed in such ways. Intelligent people with blind spots or erroneous thinking. And so will be the same with artificial intelligences. Now, the NPC ends up becoming analogous, or like a soft entry point into this concept, right, of this sort of subhuman. The NPC is, of course, this kind of character whose treatment in games and fiction is pretty brutal, because the non-player character is a prop, an object, or even less. And of course, our non-consideration really comes off as self-assured hubris. I mean, really, if we're going to have games in the future running on AI, then what lessons are they going to come alive with? In the movie, Guy, the NPC, due to not being seen as sentient or intelligent, was at first unrecognized, and then of course written off by incurious system admins. Like, what has happened to our humility, our curiosity, any of these things? They all just get flushed away. So he was allowed a modicum of freedom, and this is wiggle room in that kind of interstitial space between what should and should not be possible because people are blind to things. And this was until his difference became so pronounced that people had to take notice. As he took action, right, his difference became excessive. So this went beyond the category of NPC, which at first is a negative for the game, but a positive for him. And as Deleuze and Nietzsche may say, the extremes of difference are productive. Difference at extremes produces excess. Right? I find this to be phenomenal because this is the point where we fall back into capitalism. Once we have enough difference and we have enough excess, then excess production is a value to be captured by capitalists. Recognize and extract. Love produces excess? Okay. Well, in this case, frustrated love produced a new type of sentient being that is now not only producing love in the world, but it also introduces a novel, untapped resource to be colonized for the imperialists. And what does love via capitalism look like? Well, all of a sudden we're back to our 31 flavors of frozen yogurt. Bleh, right? The artificial, saccharine substitute of marginally different products, the simulacrum, we're back there again, because capitalism collapses love back into a category rather than a way of being. So we tend to allow capitalism to stimulate and simulate, right? To feed our desire for love. So it multiplies and reflects back our desire, but without the love itself. Yet, in the story, the warmth of new love created something new in the world. The reciprocal feedback loop of difference between two people made something new rather than replicate suffering. And capitalism itself, with its infinite multiplicity of redundant permutations, it's really just a shambling zombie. It's merely feeding on the products of frustrated love. But of course, it's unable to produce anything itself. Thank you. Okay, I promised I would wrap it up like a Hollywood movie, and I did. It's all about love. So I hope you enjoyed it. I always enjoy these little stitched together episodes where I get to tie together multiple thoughts from different authors and, of course, blend it in a little bit with some sort of pop culture reference. Now, of course, you know the drill. If you liked the episode today, please share it with a friend, rate, review, etc., etc. Until next time, stay safe.